In 1934, just 2 years after Conan the Barbarian made his first appearance on the page, a story called The Black God's Kiss was published in Weird Tales magazine. The author of the tale, C.L. Moore, was a secretary who'd been forced to abandon her college education by the onset of the Great Depression. She published under her initials, not in an attempt to conceal her gender, but to keep her employers from finding out about her literary work. However, before too long, her success would outstrip whatever fears she had in that regard, and she would go on to become one of the defining voices in sword and sorcery fiction. In the 6 Jirel of Joiry stories, Moore would explore the world and adventures of the titular warrior woman, who, like many of her genre mates, traveled between fantastical worlds, fought black-hearted wizards, and delved into mind-bending mysteries human beings were not meant to fathom. With panache equaling that of her fiery-hearted heroine, Moore would blaze a path through the world of speculative fiction that would make room for female authors for years to come. Unfortunately, in more recent years, her work has fallen into some obscurity. Though I consider myself more than a passing fan of the sword and sorcery genre, I had not heard of Jirel and Moore until quite recently. Around the same time that I discovered these stories, though, I learned about a project to revive Jirel being undertaken by Molly Tanzer, a phenomenal fantasy and science fiction author that I've been a fan of for quite some time, as well as the fine folks over at New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine. Molly herself was kind enough to sit down with Ben and I to discuss the Jirel stories, sword and sorcery as a genre, and her new project, Jirel and the Mirror of Truth. As always, we hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome back to the Infinite Library, everybody. As always, I'm your host, John.
I'm your host, Ben.
And today we are joined by a very special guest. We have the author of the upcoming Jirel and the Mirror of Truth, science fiction and fantasy author Molly Tanzer here with us today. Molly, hello. Thank you so much for coming to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So we are here talking today about the Jirel of Joiry stories. Joiry.
I say Joiry, but I don't know if that's right. So, I guess we'll see if we get anybody in the session notes complaining about it. But that's fine. I learned so much from that. So, hopefully people will be like, no. But I just say Joiry.
It's interesting because I don't know if Jirel is a real name or if it's her kind of doing a spin on a name, or obviously Joiry is not a real place, but I don't know if she spoke any French. So it's one of those things where
there's a few words in there, but my suspicion is not too much, but that's fine.
No, it's absolutely fine. But funny pronunciation's always tricky.
Yeah.
But that's why we read instead of reading aloud. All right.
Yeah, and then podcaster's medium is you're like, oh wait, I've been reading this and I don't know how to pronounce it. So,
I know. Oh my gosh, it's such a nightmare. Sometimes I'm still there's words that I'm still wait, did I learn the correct pronunciation of this? What was it is it detritus or detrite? I think it's detritus. I don't know. I was corrected the other day about that one and I was I don't know, it.
Yeah. I could define it though. Yeah.
Yes, I know what it is. I just don't know how to say it. But
and also with the name, I did watch a couple videos and a lot of people were over pronouncing the L. So it was Jirel. Yeah. I was I got a couple of those, which I thought was maybe just an emphasis thing. But I think whichever one works.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, we'll understand.
If she cared, she would have put it in a letter somewhere.
Probably. And I still wouldn't have read that. So
Absolutely. So for those of you who are uninitiated, as I was until fairly recently, Jirel of Joiry, series of 5 or 6 sword and sorcery stories written by a woman named C.L. Moore in the 1930s. Held to be kind of one of the real classic works of sword and sorcery fiction. So that's, your Conans, your Red Sonjas, all that good stuff. And really held to be probably the first female hero in one of these stories. So like I said, I was pretty new to this, despite being a pretty long-time Sword and Sorcery fan. Molly, I was wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit about your history with this character, given you're doing this new adaptation.
Sure.
From what I can tell, kind of the first adaptation in this world in a long time. So
yeah, this will be the first Jirel story in 85 years. We're working with the estate. It's like an officially licensed Jirel story, and the estate of Seal Moore has been really great. We're hoping to work with them again. We'll see. But yeah, like Seal Moore was such an interesting person, and like I came to them a little bit later than I did Conan, and even Imaro, Charles Sanders' African sword and sorcery hero, which I think is just like one of the greatest sort of manifestations of the genre that exists. And I think that, I have my own theories as to why Jirel has kind of fallen away. But I'm glad to be part of bringing her back, because I do think she goes unnoticed a lot of the time. And part of that is there's just so few stories compared to someone like Conan. It's never and like with Red Sonja, like that's even sort of like a later adaptation. Like she's a Howard character, but her name is spelled differently. And the Red Sonja that we get like in the Bridget Bardot movie and like all the comics and stuff is much more based sort of on Jirel than like the original Red Sonja, who was like a Polish mercenary. And so like I think that Jirel sort of went by the wayside for a few different reasons, and including that I think that the first story is like considered contentious for reasons that we can or cannot get into, just like not my favorite conversation to have. But like I think that she has kind of gone unregarded, and I'm glad to sort of participate in bringing her back, because the Jirel stories are super good. Like they're really vital. They're really wonderfully written. I think Seal Moore is like an excellent writer. And I like a lot of old pulp writing. Like I'll defend H.P. Lovecraft's writing, even when people are like, oh, I'm like, no, here's why. But I do think she sort of had an exceptional talent for like clear, concise, beautiful prose. And so I am really hopeful that people will start reading her stuff, because it's really good. Like the stories are pretty rock and roll. They're like really, really interesting and well paced and full of really bizarre and fascinating like scenarios for this sword and sorcery heroine. So
yeah, I was going to say reading all of them, and they were written sort of over various years. You could tell that like some of the like settings and the things that she does changes a little bit. So to me, I got this impression of like this character that exists, but like can just be in these different settings and stuff and just kind of do her thing. And like, cause like the first two are obviously like kind of related, but then like she meets like a wizard, and then it becomes like kind of like a horror supernatural thing towards the end. And so, yeah, like it's interesting to me that she's like, she can sort of be in all of these settings, but there isn't like the definitive Jirel work or something like that.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that, and this is just such a weird poll, and I know that, but one of the things that I really liked about them was that they really reminded me of one of my favorite lady heroines. I don't know if you would really call her that, from when I was a kid, which is Aeon Flux, which is just this like weird cartoon on MTV.
Yeah.
Like totally S&M themed, and like they're great. I used to catch them late at night, and they just have this sort of episodic quality where it's like, didn't she die and get turned into a soccer mom by like a psychic baby last time? Like, it doesn't matter. Now we're in the future. And I'm like, great. Like, and so I love those kinds of stories that have that. They're related because they're about the same character, but they may not have this sort of obsession with like continuity and magic systems and stuff that like modern authors tend to really focus on. I just like that it's just like some random stuff that Seal Moore was thinking about, and it's like, what if ghosts? Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. What if ghosts? And I just think that's really cool. So,
and honestly, the Aeon Flux stuff is a good comparison, just because like she will like do smart things, and then she'll do dumb things and get killed, and then it'll just be a new story. Like she's constantly like just doing things. Like it's not always the best thing or always the right thing. It's just like whatever the story needs her to do.
She also has the worst taste in men who are always trying to kiss her, and so I don't know. I know this is like so big brain stuff, but like I think one of the reasons I really did like them is like I just remember the first time I turned on MTV and like caught the tail end of one of those cartoons, and like my mind was blown. And so like I think I just like see a lot of that in there, and I think that's one of the reasons that I just really ended up liking them. They're like great. Like,
yeah, I think what you're speaking to is something that I've always really like spoken to me in sword and sorcery fiction. I remember kind of coming across stuff like Conan when I was like, young teenager. And I remember I kind of knew I liked fantasy stuff already, but
like really gravitated more towards like the sword and sorcery side than like the Tolkien side of things. I've kind of grown and I've learned to appreciate Tolkien, but I really like the episodic quality. The idea that the adventure is always happening. Like I always kind of rebelled against this thing in kind of Tolkienian fantasy where it's all about this return home eventually. And I was always like, I don't want to go home. Like I want to go out and I want to have the adventure and I want the adventure to keep happening and for new things to happen, for the person to end like in a different place than where they began, rather than, this one arc that we just follow, in a circle. Sure. And I think that these stories do that. I think something that I was pretty interested in this is that it's grounded in real history, quote unquote, from the standpoint that canonically she is living in medieval France, but we don't really learn anything about her life story. We don't kind of know how she ended up in the position she is in. There's very few references to her past. It's kind of this always just this presence. And maybe there's connections from one story to the next, but we're not necessarily like following like an exact like life path. No, that leaves so much interesting room to explore. I don't know a lot about what your new story is going to do, and if you even have an idea of where it might fall within these other 6 stories. But yeah, it's really interesting just the possibilities that gives you. Yeah, and I think that's why these this genre really kind of sticks around, is because you can play around with it in a way that you can't play around with some of these other kind of modes of fantasy. Yeah. I mean, the story that I wrote, I do locate it after sort of I don't know. I wouldn't want to get into a fight about it, but like, I do kind of see the stories as existing. They do kind of refer to one another. And so I do kind of see them as appearing in an order. But mine is definitely set after the end of like Hellsguard. If you do believe there is an order, like it does take place afterwards. And one reason is like, I kind of wanted to like, I wanted Jirel to be like a little bit older. Like, I mean, it's a different time. We're in a different era. And, she doesn't really have an age in the stories, but she's certainly not an older woman. Like she's definitely like in her youngish prime. And I've sort of put her in her middle prime, I guess I would say, just because I have an interest in writing sort of older characters these days. And I just thought it would be appropriate to sort of have her there be some distance between what I'm doing and what C.L. Moore was doing. And so that was definitely like a conscious choice I made to try to give, because also like I made a very conscious decision to not try to imitate C.L. Moore's style, because I don't write like her and I didn't think that I could do that. And plus like the conventions of storytelling have really changed since the 30s. And so while I have no complaints with her stories, like a lot of them are like, here's 20 pages of what she saw when she was walking around. And I'm like, yeah, I love this. Like, tell me more about the spooky landscape. But modern storytelling tends to be a lot more fast paced. There tends to be a lot more dialogue. There tends to be more character. And so knowing that I wasn't going to try to write a Jirel story in the style of C.L. Moore, I also wanted to capture the spirit of those stories while making it distinctly my own and putting more dialogue into it, having her be in a slightly different place in her life, a slightly different location. And so like, negotiating it in that way so it wouldn't sound like bad C.L. Moore, because I was just like, that's not what I want to do with that.
I feel like you can even see it changing over the course of the stories, because I feel like she likes the double modifiers, and then by Hellsguard, I noticed like she's very particular with what modifiers she uses in Hellsguard, and I was like, you can even kind of tell like what's her changing the way she does things, like just even the course of these stories. So like that makes sense to me in terms of like an
Hellsguard
adaptation.
Is my favorite, I guess, if I had to pick one. Like Hellsguard is far and away my favorite of the stories. I just think that it is just so. Like every moment in that story is just like such an adventure, and it's just so spooky and weird, and like the ideas in it are so fascinating, because like I mean I like all of them. I have mixed feelings on Quest of the Starstone, as most do. Like it's either you really are into Quest for the Starstone or you are very against it. I have my own reasons for not liking it as much, but I usually love Sword and Planet. Like, give me all that stuff. Like, I definitely want barbarian space.
Yeah.
Like, God, I guess if we're gonna talk about the history of sword and sorcery, I probably have to restrain myself talking about gore because I know way too much about it. But like, yeah, so like I'm there for Sword and Planet, but I just feel like there's such a different vibe to that story that I just don't really like. It's really more of a Smith story than a Jirel story.
Listen.
Yeah, I was telling John, or well, yeah, go ahead, John, because I have a thing about that too, but we don't have to get into it. Yeah.
Warning for the listeners: Google gore at your own peril. You will not be the same when you finish googling that, and the Infinite Library takes no legal responsibility for how you feel or what you do after.
I'm gonna put siren noises underneath that, so there's like sirens, like very tiny sirens going off, like at your own risk. Google.
They're still out there, man. Like the gore people are still. They're still out there. It was like for a while ago, like the big place that you would find them is like Second Life. Like long after most people on Second Life, like the Gorians were on Second Life. Like I did a deep dive a while ago into this and was just like, well, what does it look like when you're a gore person in this day and age? Like, where do you go? And it's like, oh, Second Life. And I'm like, naturally. And so there's not many message boards anymore where you do that sort of like chat role play or whatever they were doing in an earlier time. So I don't know. We don't actually have to make this my strange fascination with it.
Well, yeah, much like the Jirel stories, that's a hint towards a bigger world that we don't have to necessarily go to if we don't want to. Well, I did want to mention the quest of the, what was it? It was Quest of the Starstone, right? Or yeah, so one, it was interesting seeing that story. So she wrote that with her husband, and it was like one of the first story, well, the only story in the collection to have like bits, like characters doing jokes, because I feel like a lot of it is like serious and like rightly so. And it reminded me of, I saw recently Deathstalker 2.
Oh my God, Deathstalker 2. Yeah,
sure. It reminded me exactly of Deathstalker 2, where like there's clearly a version of this, which I haven't seen the first one, but I just looked it up, that's like serious and violent and like incredibly horny. And this is like horny, but also like hilarious, like making fun of itself like repeatedly.
I'm gonna get you, Deathstalker. Like, oh my God, that movie. I just saw Deathstalker 4, which I guess exists. They did it on MST3.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I didn't even know. Yeah.
That was one of the worst things that I've even seen on MST3. And I was just like, oh, a Deathstalker movie. Like none of them were good, but let's see how. Oh my God. And so.
But yeah, there's like something about like the idea that we're gonna make fun of this sort of what's happening, even though like normally it's like, or before it was like serious and like, straight faced, I guess. Yeah.
Sure. No, I mean, like my weird big problem with it is that it's really the only story in which Jirel is like, are you a bunch of women like cowering? And I'm like, she doesn't usually talk like that. Like that's one of the reasons I really like Jirel is that she's not like she doesn't have a lot of other women around her. There are a lot of women in those stories, but not really companions. They're usually adversaries, or they're just like weirdos that show up in the texts in some way. But like, she's never really using woman as an insult. And yet in Quest of the Starstone, she does like several times. And I'm just like, I don't like, Ms. Moore, did you write this? Or is this like the hand of Kuttner? Like, I don't know. Probably someone could tell me. I've never asked online to get many responses to this, but it just wasn't that really turned me off from it. And because I just think it's so interesting in the other stories that she doesn't pull that kind of thing. Because older stuff that focuses on women, that they'll be like, not your average girl. They're like exceptional in some way, and that women are like so and so, but they're not. And I kind of like that she is indeed doing something different than the other women in those stories, but she's never like
looking down on people.
No, she's never looking down on women. She's never like girls be like, she's not doing that. But in Star is, and I'm like, it's not for me. But
yeah.
And there's just like more like just like hijinks and like just like bits and stuff. Like
and she's also like she like sees that space wizard and she's like, oh my God, oh no. And then like Northwest Smith is like, don't worry, Jirel. And I'm like, I don't. Like I don't like my girl would never like she would get mad at this wizard. She hates wizards just because he
just immediately
her, like cower and stuff. I don't know. Yeah, I had a lot of thoughts about it. Like obviously.
Just since we haven't like kind of laid out what this story is versus the other stories, it's okay. Sorry. No, it's fine. We're having so much fun that it's easy to forget we're doing this to put out in front of an audience. But Quest of the Starstone is the one kind of non-canonical Jirel of Joiry story. The collection I picked up for the recording today, the Del Rey collection, it's not included in there.
Yeah.
So I actually had to track it down elsewhere in preparation for the show. Like Ben, I think, mentioned this was a story written with her husband, who is also an author. And it's a crossover story between Jirel of Joiry, who, as we've kind of laid out, is a sword and sorcery kind of medieval knight lady character, and then Northwest Smith, who is, from what I can tell, I didn't read any of the like Northwest Smith standalone stories for this. He's like an interplanetary, like kind of John Carter of Mars type, I guess.
He's
maybe like a little bit more of like a cowboy instead of
cowboy rogue kind of guy, but like he appears in Shambleau, which was I think Moore's first
that was her first story,
published story, and so like he's like her character. He hangs out in a bar. He's got like a weird sidekick. He's always
he was like a drunk cat or something, like
heists and stuff. And so that's her other main creation that she is known for, is Northwest Smith and Jirel of Joiry. And so in this they team up.
Yeah, and I likewise, like, I also did not like it. I liked that we kind of did see a little bit more of Jirel, like in her castle, like with her like retainers. I very quickly didn't like it when she started acting out of character, but like it was kind of interesting to see like when Northwest and Yannel, I think is the name of his weird sidekick, the Venusian sidekick. It's been a while
since I read that one.
But like they get like picked up basically by one of Jirel's like men at arms and like brought into the castle, and I kind of like the way that we see like how like the people of this fiefdom like kind of view their lady, and the fact that like all the men seem totally cool being led by Jirel, which again I really like. I kind of like that the stories don't again kind of the very nature of them, the fact they're kind of doing, she very quickly most of the time is going off and doing a magical adventure, and we don't really spend a lot of time in kind of like the social context. But I kind of like that it doesn't get super bogged down in like, oh, how did the men in the army feel about having a woman lead them? It's just like Jirel kicks ass. Like
there's context clues. Like she's obviously like strong and like very interesting, and they like follow her very devotedly. I mean, like you see them a little bit in Jirel Meets Magic, and you see them a little bit in the Darkland. You see sort of like the way that her people view her, and they're very devoted to her. Not just like her weird priest who's always like, you shouldn't go do Satan stuff. She's like, try me or not, I'm gonna go do Satan stuff. And he's just like, oh, Jirel, like that guy's great. Is he also a G name? It's like, I don't know.
Gervais, Father Gervais.
Yeah, like her priest. But you
she's like, I'm gonna do it anyway. Like, you
can either do, like shrive me, whatever. I'm not Catholic. Like, she can shrive me or not, but I'm gonna do it. And he's like, oh, okay, like here you go.
Molly, Ben and I went to Catholic school growing up. That's kind of how we know each other. We went to different schools, but we had mutual friends.
Different Catholic
schools. The only people who still say shrive are like absolute weirdos.
Is that the word that he uses?
It is, but it's. I think it's very clearly on her part. It's an intentional kind of anachronism, or again, I don't know if she had any Catholic
or like older use case,
this might be a word that she just picked up doing whatever reading she did that kind of inspired this story.
Sure.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think nowadays a priest would say, like, absolve me or let me confess to you, as opposed to shrive, I think. But
did have a vibe of being from the past in a way, but I was like, I should probably, I don't know. I asked a friend who also went to Catholic school, and he was like, yeah, I don't know. I think it just makes you fine again in the Lord's eyes. And I'm like, okay, moving on. Like, I don't know.
It's confession.
Yeah. I also like, though, that she needs to get like confession for going to the underworld, I guess,
she dies
because
down there, right?
it's like
there's kind of an implication she doesn't fully know like what she's getting into, and like there's like a certain level where I think she thinks she might literally be descending into hell before she kind of gets a slightly better idea of what's going on.
Yeah, and it's not. I guess it's not like exactly hell. I like how it's sort of, to me, indeterminate, unless it is very clear what it is, and I'm not familiar with the setting. But
for people who haven't read the Jirel stories, like, go do that. But also, like, there's 2 instances in which she like takes confession or is shriven or whatever this word is, and one of them is the Darkland, which is a later story. But then the first one, Black God's Kiss, which is the first of the Jirel stories. Her castle is her castle falls to a rival knight, and she is locked up, and she's like, the only way I can get him back is to descend into this like another dimension to find a way, like no sword will be able to take him down. I have to figure out some sort of supernatural way to like get this guy harder than anyone's ever got. And then conveniently she has like a portal to hell like in her basement, which like something that I have never experienced. But I love that it's just there, and they're like, we just put something on top of it so that people wouldn't go down there. But before she goes, and presumably, like, you would think, given the way she phrases it, that she's gone down there before, but we never really find out why or what happened with that. But her priest is all like, you really shouldn't do this, and she's like, confess me so that I can go down there with like a clean conscience, or not, but I'm doing it anyway. And he does like his thing, and then she goes down there to her basement hell portal.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like this like tube. The language gets like very like supernatural almost, and like non-realistic, and like there's like this tube that you slide down, and then there's like these demons that she can't see, but she cuts them in half, and like the blood gets all on her. Like it's very like visceral when she's like descending, which was, I enjoyed. That was cool.
The thing that I really think is really cool, and one of the elements of the story that I really liked is the fact that she can't see like this dimension she's walked into until she takes off her crucifix, which I just thought was this really like evocative detail that just, kind of, Ben, you mentioned earlier, the way that these stories kind of, we start in kind of a mundane-ish reality, and then they open up into kind of these wider vistas. And, her taking up the crucifix, it's literally kind of this unveiling, but it also just speaks to like a very like weird detailed
God's not here,
it's like, okay, so the Christian God might be real, but also so is all this other stuff. And if the Christian God is real, he's also not really like helping a whole lot.
No, it is interesting. And I also just love that the stories like give no fucks about explaining it either. Like, I mean, it's definitely not like, and here's okay, like, let me explain to you what this means. It's just like that's one of the things I really like about sword and sorcery are those moments where, and I think this is something that's sort of endemic to the genre, is that like, it's like blink and you'll miss it kind of stuff. But like then later when you're thinking about it, you're like, that is a weird detail that like I would love to know more about. But like it's never been explained to me in the way that like a Tolkien or like a like who else does like Ellie Modisette or like all these other sort of like C series that are like very about like the details and like let me explain this to you. Sword sorcery is like keep up or not.
Or then like maybe kind of the worst example of this is like the Brandon Sanderson thing, where it's like, oh, we're gonna hit the brakes on the plot for like 30 pages so I can explain my made-up physics.
I'm always sort of team like, it's magic. If you could reproduce it, it's science, which is a very contentious viewpoint. And I'm not saying I'm right. I just sort of take that attitude in my own writing, because like if it's magic, it's inherently unknowable, and that's one of the things that makes magic really cool. And I know that like Harry Potter and magic school is like this whole thing that we've sort of come to expect in the last like 30 years, but it's not really something that fantasy has ever really had to reckon with in the past. Like this is all sort of, in my opinion, like very new to like get that deep into it, although like there are examples from the past. So
yeah, I think that also explains some of the twists in this story, because like if we knew what the rules are, she wouldn't have done it. And it's more just like, you could do this for a spell, but we don't know what'll happen, or like we don't know the consequences, or like there's a kind of like unknown element to it that's important, as opposed to like an equation or something that's like balanced clearly.
Well, and that's something that's interesting. And, again, C.L. Moore does a great job with this, the way that sword and sorcery tends to ground us in like the perspective of someone who is ignorant of kind of the big mysteries of the world. They're exploring something that they can't fully understand. I think in the case of Jirel, it's kind of because she's coming from this medieval background, and she's also clearly not particularly interested in higher.
She's very practical. Yeah. She's very practical. Yeah. Also, like when she fights the evil wizard in Jirel Meets Magic, the evil wizard is like a worshiper of some like outer god that everyone's just like, who cares about that? like it's like something she clearly believes in and I guess gets her power from, but like nobody's really interested in like delving into that more. It's more like I need to get her, I need to kill her and like get this guy
it's so funny,
that
like,
I want.
I think that's another thing with Sword and Sorcery is that like I think that like the most iconic Sword and Sorcery protagonists really do just like hate wizards. Like they just like do not like wizards in Sword and Sorcery, whereas like you always sort of have that like Gandalf's kind of guy or like a witch or whatever that's like part of things in sort of high or like even with like low or like grimdark fantasy. Like magic is sort of can also sort of be part of the world in a way that it just sort of can't in a Sword and Sorcery story. And I mean, I guess Elric would be like if you consider Elric Sword and Sorcery, like Elric would be sort of the exception to that because he is a very much a magic user and all this different stuff. But also I feel like Elric did a lot of different stuff. So like, I don't know, like if people wouldn't necessarily put him in that same.
Well, I think Elric is almost kind of the exception that proves the rule to some degree, where he kind of shows why that's such like a difficult thing to do. Not to get too off the beaten track here, but I think that a big part of why, this mode of fantasy kind of defaults there. It's the same reason why Lovecraft never wrote any stories from the perspective of a Lovecraftian like cultist. It's like you get bogged down in all the exposition, which Lovecraft sometimes managed to do anyway. But, if you're dealing with a character who knows things, all of a sudden you have the burden of explaining them. And that takes away the specialness of it.
There is sort of like a loss there of like getting to explore it with the character and getting to sort of understand or misunderstand with the character that I think is like a really fun thing that you can negotiate when your character is like, wizards, like doing their wizard stuff all the time. Like
your reader gets to kind of fill in the blanks if they want, which is like, nowadays we're used to like everything like being fully explained and like, so it's nice to be like, oh yeah, maybe there's an elder god and like we don't know what's going on with that, but like, it's open to whatever you want to put in there. So
it's fun.
Yeah.
Like it's fun. It's a fun genre. Like it's definitely had its rough spots, and I understand sort of why it has gained a sort of a reputation of being a bit like backward, but like I do think that there are a lot of like lively people coming to the genre now and that have always sort of been there, that have brought like an energy that is interesting and not necessarily like painfully orientalist or like whatever your various complaints might be about like valid complaints about Sword and Sorcery. I do think there always have been these sort of exceptions. Like I was saying with like Charles Saunders and his Amaro stories like that.
Yeah.
That's really what brought me back into the fold was when Nightshade did an edition of all of the Amaro stories like a million years ago. And I read them and I was just like, holy shit, like this has totally changed my perspective on the genre. And I think that it's just so interesting when you see people who are carving out a space for themselves in a genre that maybe didn't have the most like accepting origins, right? Like where like women certainly have like a role in a lot of Sword and Sorcery stories, like people of color have a certain role in a lot of Sword and Sorcery stories, but a lot of people like me and like other writers have been like, no, this rules, but what if it wasn't, what if we just sort of shifted the focus a little in a few different directions to make it like we can all take part in this? And I think that's been like really, really wonderful for the genre.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I really appreciate in what of your work I have had the chance to read. I'll admit I'm not a Molly Tanzer completionist yet. But again, we were talking a little bit about this before the show, but I came across your work through your story, The Terrible History of the Ivy Bridge Twins.
The Infernal History of the
Infernal History, I think that's right.
I read that like a long time ago, but yeah, I think it's Infernal History.
Yeah, but I came across that one because I was looking for information on the Lovecraftian deity Gloom, one of the lesser known ones. And, you obviously are taking a very, what I really appreciate about your work is not just that you're kind of bringing these different perspectives, to Lovecraftiana, which God knows, I mean, the man himself brought a lot of baggage there. And then a lot of people seem to like that part of the work and have carried it forward. Oof. But I like the way that you not only kind of bring this different perspective, but also use Lovecraftian elements to tell very different kinds of stories. You know, like that story is kind of a 16th century or 1600s kind of like.
Yeah, I think it's
like almost kind of like a Jacobean revenge drama a little bit.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking 18th century with it, but it's a picaresque. That's sort of like was sort of inspiration for it, was like a picaresque about incestuous twin necromancers was sort of how I pitched it. It's like my second published story ever, so I'm always really excited when it comes up because it was just so, I think that was published in like 2010 or 2011, and so like it's nice to hear that it's still out there and being read because I'm very fond of it. But yeah, like that was my second published story and my first foray into sort of the Lovecraftian fiction world. And since then I've done like a lot of different stuff with that. And it is like it's a difficult community to negotiate at times, but I do feel that it has in a lot of ways expanded into the realm of just sort of a cosmic horror fandom. And also like a lot of the sort of retrograde elements have not felt welcome, and sort of like you would never find that kind of attitude at like Necronomicon. And you certainly never find it at like the HP Lovecraft Film Festival. And so like the major sort of centers for,
are they like purists or like hardliners?
They're like, no, fuck it up, man. Like, let's get like, make it weird.
Oh, okay,
like,
cool. Okay,
let's like have different kinds of people that as guests of honor, and let's have different sort of like, I mean, the year that I was guest of honor at Necronomicon, they also had like Dempo Torishima, who's sort of this Japanese author. And so they're really trying to like open it up to the sort of global community and make it more accepting and make it more vital and like hear what other people have to say about it. And I just think that that's really great because like, I mean, Lovecraft was definitely like a fraught figure. Like he had a lot of problems, to put it mildly, and I think that that's one of the reasons that his fiction has some of the power that it does, because it comes from this place of fear. But I do see that different kinds of people are approaching the concept of fear through this Lovecraftian or this cosmically horrible lens to like very interesting ends. Like I think that that's really, really cool, because I think there's the space for it. And honestly, even if he would not, I mean, who can know what he would say about anything, but like he always encouraged people to play in his world and to use his characters and to like appropriate his vibe. And so like, we're just doing what you said, like guy. And so like, I do kind of wonder like where he would come down on it. But I think the answer is probably not the one that I would want, because he is who he was who he was. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I always think about I can't remember the title, but that one about that guy that never leaves the house, and then he leaves the house and everyone's like afraid of him. And then he looks in the mirror and sees that like he's the monster. Like
The Outsider.
The Outsider?
I think so. Yeah, I always think about that in terms of, like clearly like he had some, fraught relationship with himself that then like became something else, but like that always comes to mind when people talk. Yeah, so I think that makes total sense that fear is kind of like the underlying thing within his stuff.
Jeffrey Combs do a live reading of The Outsider at HP Lovecraft Film Festival, like back in like 2015, and it was definitely really awesome. Like he definitely chewed the scenery pretty hard. It was really great.
Nice.
So.
Yeah.
Well, do we want to maybe kind of circle back to Jirel? I could sit here and talk Lovecraft all day. Maybe we'll have to have you back on to do a big Lovecraft extravaganza at some point.
I can definitely talk a long time about it.
Yeah. Absolutely. I've always said Lovecraft is probably the author that just kind of latched onto my brain when I was like 13 years old, and just for better or worse, no other artist has had as much like impact on.
You're not alone.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, there's power there, regardless of what his personal viewpoints are. I don't know. One more thing, and then we can kind of return. But I think if you're a deep reader, I think that we were talking a little bit before about the show about kind of modern ways of thinking about art, and the ways people tend to want a very particular morality to certain characters or things today. And I think that if you're a deep reader, you kind of have to learn how to just navigate those questions. one of the kind of starting points for the show was Don Quixote, which is
Yeah.
undoubtedly a great book, but there's also the bit where Sancho Panza is like thinking about how many slaves he's going to buy and how much fun it's going to be to do no work because he's going to have like 50 slaves.
Yeah.
And you just kind of have,
What? Like what?
You have to just kind of learn to, again, I don't know. We still kind of trace everything back to the Iliad, which is obviously a story about people who are nothing.
Yeah.
Have very different standards and views, and I don't know if I would get along with Homer if I met him. But
it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know. I always feel like like Achilles' energy is always like my energy, where I'm just like, I will sulk in my tent until I destroy you all. And so like I'm there for it, but, like maybe not in the most wholesome way.
Then that's what I think that's kind of what I'm trying. The broader point I'm trying to make is you're always navigating the differences and similarities in a way that maybe with kind of some more recent art forms people feel a little bit more friction because they're close. Things like film and video games are closer to modernity, and therefore those differences seem all the more kind of there.
Yeah. No, I was thinking a little bit about it even this morning with the passing of Shannon Doherty, and just thinking about like the placement of like Heather in sort of my life, and like the way that film has aged and the way that it has stayed really new, but also thinking about like, I mean, I never want to get to that. You could never make this film today because like, maybe that's true and maybe that's not. Lots of films get made today, but like, it does have the sort of casual school shooter humor in that film is just a very different, it hits different now than it ever did, I think, when it came out. And so like, I think as we change as a society, we're always going to have to make those negotiations, but I don't necessarily think the answer is to elide them. Like look at them head on, and humans are going to be humans. So
Yeah, and I think too, like, if it's an imaginative medium, we shouldn't necessarily block things out. Like, we should try to explore as much experience as we can. And here's my segue. Speaking of Jirel, in Black God's Kiss, she doesn't exactly make the best decision. So we haven't summarized the plot, but as Molly said, she goes to the underworld to get a weapon to kill this guy. She meets what I believe is a denizen of the lower worlds, and then she receives a kiss from this denizen, and then she gives it to the guy that she's trying to get got, and then he dies. And then she basically realizes, what have I done? I actually really like this guy. The demon was right, because the demon says something to the effect of like, there will be a punishment, or you should never receive a gift from me without expecting something. So it's sort of like the monkey's paw curling. And then she's like, I screwed up. And then it literally like ends right there, rather than like, oh, this is what I wanted, and now the story's over. So there's this sort of like sense of loss at the end, which I definitely wasn't expecting. And I know as you were hinting at, some people have their differences with that, but in terms of at least what I was expecting, I thought it was pretty cool in terms of like monkey's paw curling, like underworld magic, kind of like, we don't know how this is going to work out. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, that people interpret Black God's Kiss in a number of different ways. And I definitely think that it's this hard thing where like, if you anthologize stories, typically that's the one that you'll see most anthologized, because it is the first and it's our introduction to Jirel. And there's this great scene that anyone who is like an adult in this age is not going to be like, because like, it's like, oh my God, like bring in the leader of these forces. And it's like, it's this tall figure and three men can't restrain them, and they're wearing a helm, and the guy's like unmask this person, and it's like, oh, woman. And it's like, oh my God, I'm shocked. Like, I love it, and I think it was probably really, really hard when it was published, but that's become a trope in our day and age. And I think, and so like, it has all these different sort of things going on with her, which makes it a good story to anthologize, but also there are different negotiations about about the way that people handle the fact that this guy, like this rival knight, treats her harshly, and then like the end she seems to feel something for him. And I can understand sort of people's perspective on like what's going on in that story. I tend to read it a little differently. I think I can see what at least I believe that I can see what Seymour was going for with that, but I can understand why people have their own reactions to the story. But it also has given Jirel kind of a rep. I mean, the first time I ever heard anyone talk about her, it was like, ugh, Jirel of Joiry, she falls in love with her rapist. And that kept me from reading them for a while. And then later when I read them, I was like, wait a second, like, I feel like you could read the story in many different ways. And I think everyone is going to bring their own experience to the story. But I have never felt that that's a fair dismissal of the character or her whole thing. And I do think it's one of those things that could potentially, as it kept me from reading these stories for a while, it could definitely keep people from exploring what I think is sort of part of a really important part of like the history of women in my field. Like, I mean, like they're doing this and like she published in the magazines alongside like Howard and Lovecraft and all these different writers. And, you know, I would hate to see her erased because we've done a lot of good work interrogating that trope. But I mean, it's also exactly like flesh and blood. Like that's not really the same. That's not this, which is a movie in case you have like someone who is listening to this has not seen the movie Flesh and Blood that, oh God, it's got like Rutger Hauer and it's,
who directed it?
It's
Showgirls, the Showgirls guy.
Yeah,
Verhoeven.
Yeah, Verhoeven. It's Verhoeven's like.
Wow, I haven't heard of this.
I don't love this film. But people do like it. I'm not saying don't like it. I'm not saying don't watch it, but I'm also not saying go out and watch it. But that movie really does have a motif of falling in love with your assailant, and I don't think that's. Yeah. And so, like looking at things like that compared to the Jirel story, I just don't think that's the negotiation she's really trying to make. I do think it is sort of a bargain.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting because we kind of reference like the little touches of kind of religion in this story, and you know we get because Black God's Kiss leads into it's only like kind of direct like we have the first installment in the story and then a second installment that's a direct follow-up in the story Black God's Shadow, where basically she feels so bad about this that she redescends to the underworld basically to see if she can undo what she did. And you know, there's this kind of beautiful scene where she's kind of found her, you know, this man she's killed, and you know, he's being tormented by this curse she's placed on him. And you know, I almost kind of had like a Christian reading of it where it's kind of this thing where it's like she realized like, oh, I didn't have the right to do like damn this person. And, you know, there's still something in him that could have been good if I hadn't done this. And, you know, she kind of finishes off the story by, you know, she hopes at least freeing his soul to go on to, as she puts, like a clean death.
He's not like bound to he's not bound anymore to whatever plane. Like he is free to do whatever happens to him after that, but her intervention in that is undone, is which I think is like that's an interesting reading. I hadn't really thought about it in that Christian context because I don't tend to read from that context, but I'm really interested in that. I think that's a fascinating interpretation of it, and it makes a lot of sense actually.
Yeah, you know, it's something where I kept kind of I'm not an expert by any means, but I've read a fair amount of medieval literature. I kind of like literature that kind of puts me in that medieval mindset. And so I kept looking for kind of touches of that here. Obviously, C.L. Moore was not like a medieval scholar. This isn't like historical fiction necessarily. Like we said, we have no idea if her name or if any of the French is particularly accurate. But I just the little touches again with the cross, her taking off the cross, her looking for confession before she makes these descents. I just thought I was trying to think like, obviously Jirel of Joiry would not be like a modern secular humanist. Like if she's going to have like beliefs about like the dignity of the soul, like theoretically at least it's going to be influenced by like medieval Catholicism, even if it's going to be idiosyncratic.
That makes a lot of sense. I really like that. Yeah, I'm fascinated by that, and like when I go back and read them again, as I'm sure I will, like that's like a really interesting stank to put on there. Like I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I also like the comparison with this guy who she eventually, you know, descends to the underworld to sort of undo the curse, and the like weird demonic overlord in the Darkland. And I read somewhere that like Celia Moore had conceived of that like shadow guy first, and then sort of made like this general version of like the sort of weird male character that like it's sort of like Jirel has mixed feelings about, but in the Darkland one, he's clearly like, yeah, screw this guy. like he wants me as he wants me to be his night bride, and I don't want to do that. And then in sort of translating it to this other story, the person becomes more human, and like to me, it makes her more like psychologically like there's more of like a realistic psychological portrayal of her relationship. Whereas in the Darkland, it's like, yeah, just screw this guy. Like I'm gonna make this demon overlord pay for trying to be his night bride or whatever.
Later story in which Jirel is killed in battle, and she is whisked away at the point of death by this demon dude, this demon lord guy, and
Pav or whatever.
Really
Pav,
weird story. Although the thing that I thought about most the first time I read that was actually like Legend, that old Tim Curry movie with like Mia Sara. Because like there's the same scene in that, like, and I did wonder if like that movie, I don't know who the scriptwriter was for that, but like I did wonder if they had read it, because he also gives her like a black beautiful dress to put on, and like has this whole like you're gonna be my bride and like blah blah blah, and I was like, whoa, this is like, that movie definitely did stuff to my brain when I saw it in the 80s, and I was like, oh my god, like this is, I'm different now. So like it just reminded me of that so much, and I've never like taken any time to look into it, but, and certainly it's not the only instance of like he gave me a dress, but like it just like had such Legend vibes that I was like, oh, this is really wild. Like it's even like the same dress that like comes to life and dances with Mia Sara and stuff, and before she becomes sexy and evil. And
yeah, also too the evil foe, the Corpse Witch. I was like telling someone, I'm like, what a great metal band name, Corpse Witch. I was like shocked that it hadn't been used before. Just like it was like a compound noun. It's really great.
All the random women that show up in like that, the campy sorceress that we were talking about in Jirel Meets Magic, where it's just like she's like busty and she's like tormenting this naked dryad, and the dryad's like, oh no, stop, and I'm like, what is going on? Like, I am not sure.
And the cat persona too, or the
random people that sort of come in and out of the Jirel stories, and then like you never see them again, and it's just like, oh yeah, okay, like.
Yeah, the Corpse Witch, like that was probably my favorite part of like otherwise probably my least favorite story in the collection. Not saying it's bad, just like it's definitely the one where, especially like my collection kind of. The Del Rey collection, it does Jirel Meets Magic first, and then the Black God duology, then Darklands, then Hell's Guard, which was a little weird once I kind of went back and like actually did a little more research.
Yeah. Boy, I don't know if I would pick Jirel Meets Magic as my. See, that's my. I like the intro and I like the ending, but the middle part, I'm just like, yeah, okay, she saw some like move it along, like
right,
like a little impatient with. But,
Jirel Meets Magic felt like a little bit like I've kind of seen this before.
But in a way that where she's like riding down that.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, don't get me wrong, it was great, but it was just kind of like, okay, this isn't quite as like revolutionary as like I was told it was going to be until I got to Black God's Kiss, which was like, oh, this is what I'm here for. And then by the time of Darklands, like it felt like, okay, I've kind of seen the same story happen 3 times now.
She does have a thing where like she's doing her thing and then gets taken to another place and other things happen there. But I think I was sort of taken by the Darkland because of those like early childhood memeries of this movie that blew my mind. Like, well, also do like anything like that. Like I was like, this is so ripe for like a you know how like I don't know if either of you read any of the like the new spicy fantasy kind of things, and I've
heard about them. I haven't read them.
Yeah, my friend like was like, you got to read A Court of Thorns and Roses, and I was like, you know what, I should be conversant in like what is going on, and then that's an interesting retelling of Tam Lin, where sort of a lot of that kind of a lot of the Tam Lin stuff is very inverted in an interesting way. Like I was thinking about like we need a spicy reboot of Jirel's demon boyfriend in the Darkland, like, but he's going to be like good in this instance, right? Clearly you'll think he's bad, but then like surprise, actually like he's the sexier and gooder of the two characters. And I was thinking a lot about that. But
well, and it's interesting too because in the Nightland one. she ends up like killing him by accident, and there's sort of like this remorse where he's like, like come on, or something. Like it's sort of like it's sort of like a weird scene, because like in the first one, like obviously there's more there in Black God's Kiss, but then in Darkland it's like I guess I'm supposed to feel bad that he got killed by accident, but like the corpse witch is clearly like, you know, wants revenge or something. Like I don't know, there's like there's something interesting there with like the ending of that, and then like there's like this huge, like she gets like shot through space, and then she just ends up back in her bed at the end, which is like a kind of like a cool thrilling end.
Like, no, this is why I think Hellsguard is really the most complete and well realized of the Jirel stories, because it just really has like the whole way through. I just like I have no notes. Like every moment of that story is just so interesting, and you know, like whether or not it's another, like it's also sort of slightly deviates from the she's somewhere and then is somewhere else, although of course like the castle of Hellsguard is this sort of like liminal space where you can only get there at certain times of day or under a certain kind of moon or so. I can't remember, it's been a while, but like it's not really another land in the same way that like I went through this window and then there was this busty sorcerer kind of like kind of thing. So
I think that like I think Hellsguard was my favorite because it's kind of the one where it's like, oh, we're in like our world. And so the weird stuff that happens like just hits so much like kind of harder, because we're not just kind of like progressing through a series of like badass like prog metal album covers, which is great. But I kind of really liked seeing her in like a slightly more grounded setting where it's just like, and then that the reveal at the end of that story, like just I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever heard of.
Yeah, John, question for you. So one thing that we always talk about is almost all literature just Gothic literature. And I had a question for John. Is this a Gothic story, do you think? Because they do go into the castle and there is like a reckoning with like appetite and desire as well. It doesn't have to be Gothic, but something like there's a period where John and I just kept going like, I think this is a Gothic story. Like, so. Yeah,
I mean, I would argue, I think most of these are Gothic stories. I mean, again, in Black God's Kiss, it's literally like, oh, hell's under the castle and she has to go down there. You know, I think that sword and sorcery, like, again, I don't know if it's necessarily something that in the literature, like the critical literature is always like drawn on a lot, but I do think there is something kind of in this weirding of the past that feels very Gothic to me in stuff like Conan. You know, I think that like, I don't remember. I think I heard this on a podcast some years ago, and I'm starting to remember who said it. But like Lovecraft, who, you know, obviously not sword and sorcery, but very much kind of in the same sphere, like kind of took the Gothic to the next step by making the entire planet Earth a haunted house, or the whole universe a haunted house. And so I think that like there's a lot of Gothic influence in this kind of fiction. You know,
Well, and he loved that kind of thing too. I mean, like his supernatural literature and horror essay is like very interesting, and sort of his like tracing of all of that different kind of stuff. And it's really interesting. I have to think about this. The super is all fiction, Gothic fiction.
I mean, it's sort of like a bold, like, you know, kind of a hot take claim, but like,
I love it,
we kept on like thinking about like psychological states, like in landscape, or like, like the idea of something being haunted by the past or something like that. And then John was like, maybe all America is Gothic or something like, and then we like came back around to it eventually. So we need to riff it out a little bit more, but it's definitely something we keep coming back to. So
my girl Jane Austen had her Gothic moment too.
So like, we talked about that.
I also love that, like, I love, like, I know this is like, again, sort of self-centered, but I love characters that read a lot and then get confused and they think like the real thing is what they read is the real thing. Cause like, I feel like that's ripe for just like perennial instances of like confusing fiction with reality. Sure. And I think that's super cool.
I mean, so. When we were talking a little bit earlier before we started recording, but like my master's is in 18th century literature, and the novelized woman was like a trope in the 18th century, especially among other like lady novelists. And then also men would also put this like sort of stock character of like the girl who has read too many novels, and how like that has made her have certain expectations for reality. And I'm always excited to see like a novelized person who's sort of like so colonized by the fictional world that they have no other lens to view reality. And I'm just like very there for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like that's also me. Like I was a weird nerdy kid who read all the time. I grew up in a house that was like miles away from other people. And so like I spent a lot of time reading. And so like my understanding of the world certainly came from fiction in ways that were probably not great. But have served me well in my career. So that's fine. But yeah.
Yeah.
So who can say if it was bad?
Yeah. I'm fine. Like,
out.
I don't know, whatever. But yeah, like in terms of like socializing effectively with other children, like not so much, but like whatever. Like, I'm in my 40s now. It doesn't matter. So
yeah, no. I think Ben and I could probably find similar.
Yeah.
sure.
And also with Don Quixote too. Yeah, like it's like a thing that comes around.
No,
the reading too much and then being a certain kind of way.
Well, and then when he becomes his own novel subject and like the second half, like it's just like so interesting to sort of see that process and the sort of meta fictional aspect of it, which I'm a much more like first part of Don Quixote person, which you would think I would like the second half more, but like for some reason it just doesn't hit quite as hard as like the first half. But like I do love that he becomes his own subject in a way that's like very modern in a sort of strange, interesting way, and like I feel is very relatable to sort of modern fiction and things like that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
For it.
Don Quixote probably would have loved the Jirel of Joiry stories.
Yeah,
that priest would have had to tear this book out of his cold dead hands.
Really good. Yeah.
He's like I'm gonna meet Jirel.
I mean, they do have that sort of romance nature of them, like in terms of, and like she doesn't
absolutely.
really. I mean, like God, who was I just talking to about like who's the guy who wrote the rise of the novel? Like, I mean, like, but like that sort of conception of the novel as the 18th century novel of why can I never remember this man's name?
Oh man,
I feel like I know who you're talking about, but yeah,
the novel.
Oh, I like the clicky sounds. Do you have a
Yeah, I have a
yes,
mechanical keyboard.
Same, me as well.
And I got the one with the clickiest switches I could get, which always fun for the show. Are we talking about Ian Watt? Rise of the Novel?
Like a very contentious and old sort of conception of the novel, but I mean, does Jirel grow and change psychologically throughout her stories? Like, no, I mean, they are novelette length, so they're not sort of like, but I would say that they really more are, speaking to their medieval nature, much more of the romance than of the novel. If we believe that the novel must have sort of some psychological change on behalf of the protagonist, which I'll argue for in some days, and then other days I'll be like, I'm an adult. I don't have to care about that. So I don't.
Yeah.
You know, I do think it's interesting kind of you saying that, you know, does Jirel undergo like character growth in kind of like the traditional like novelistic sense? I agree. I think she is kind of more in the heroic mode, I guess we would say, which I think we could probably say of a lot of like sword and sorcery protagonists. Like Conan obviously undergoes like character development, but it's always kind of like off screen, basically. It's kind of happening in like the long gaps between those stories. But I think that Jirel's really interesting because despite like kind of not undergoing kind of traditional character development, I think she's actually like a really like psychologically like dynamic character.
I agree.
It's that's actually kind of her superpower, I guess you would say, is that she just has this like tremendous reserve of will and like desire to like kind of almost like in a Nietzschean way, like exert her like will on the world.
Yeah, and she like overcomes magic too. Like when the sorcerer curses her, she just kind of like forces her way out of it and kills him basically at the end of Jirel Meets Magic. Which it's like
where she's just like whatever. Like I just like it. She's very resilient, and I think that's one of the things I really enjoy about her. But yeah, I do. She's not. I think that she is such a complete and interesting. She's just herself in this really way. And like when I was negotiating with the writing of it, like that's what I really wanted to focus on capturing, and like what I really truly wanted to make sure survived that, and like her preference for just the worst men. But like canonical, like she just has terrible taste. And so like I was like, well, what do we need to have a Jirel story? And I was like, well, there has to be a wizard who's a jerk, and like she has to make some choices that are very like not self-motivated, but like let's get it done. Like she needs to have sort of impulsive, she has to be impulsive, but also like not stupid. Like she's calculating, but not necessarily like deep thinking thoughts about herself in the sort of ever inward kind of mode. And like that was challenging for me because like I don't know, a friend of mine once read a book of mine and was like, your characters spend a lot of time thinking about their own thoughts. And I was like, do people not do that? Is that weird? Like, I think a lot about my own thoughts, and it's haunted me ever since. Where I was like, okay, well, like, is this a character who thinks about her thoughts, or is this a character who doesn't? And Jirel is not interested in that. Like, she is definitely not quite all about that. And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about my story, Jirel, and the Mirror of Truth, is that I gave her a friend. That was one thing that I saw that was sort of like a lack. Like she doesn't really have a friend in the C.L. Moore stories. And so I gave her a companion whose name is Thevin Galois. She's an exiled knight of the Court of Truth. She's like a drunk and she's sort of a wreck. And they are like, they have like good like rogue warrior combo energy, like meathead and conniving person. But Thevin is she's one of the reasons that she is so messed up is she's very introspective but doesn't want to be, whereas Jirel is just like not introspective and doesn't understand that sort of like, she's just sort of like, let's take care of this right now. And Thevin has a lot going on. And it was actually really interesting. Like I loved Thevin and I had to stop her from kind of taking over the story because the minute I came up with her, I was like, this character. And it was like, this is not your assignment. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. But I do think I wrote it in with them having like a fun dynamic. And then it was also like an interesting place for me to put in a little more like Thevin is a lesbian. And so she is definitely like has this sort of sapphic vibe that like I really wanted to sort of bring more sort of into the stories that were necessary, like, and also sort of like there is a sexiness to the Jirel stories that I think is really good. And I wanted to find like other spaces to bring that in because I'm not censored. It's not the 30s. And so I can do what I want. And so like, I definitely not as wild as other things I've written, which I kind of have a rep for, but I wanted to find more space for human sexuality in these stories because that is such a major part of them. And if it is pretty heterocentric in the original stories, so.
And there's like kind of that throwaway line too about her like having known relationships, but since it's the 30s, like so it's like it's just like kind of a hint.
Like not a blushing virgin, and she's just got it going on. She's just like living her life, and the way that I think is very interesting for not only like a character set in the Middle Ages, but for a character who was sort of in the 1930s. Like she has interesting vibe, to use a very modern word to describe it, I guess.
She has good aura.
Yeah, you know, I'm curious, Molly, you know, we don't have to get too into this, but I definitely read some kind of literature by people who read her relationship with the sorceress in the first, and Jirel Meets Magic as kind of sapphic. And, you know, I think that maybe sometimes, especially when we're kind of looking at art from the past, like people kind of maybe look a little closer than was intended. Kind of looking for those vibes, and I definitely got like the sorceress is like sexy in that story, but I didn't necessarily read it in like a full on like. No, I'm not sure. I mean,
like Jirel, I think is pretty canonically straight. Like if you are like big dumb lunkhead, like she is like, oh great, like my type, like absolutely. But I do think that there is a vibe between her and the sorceress. I think that, but I also think it's one of those things where I just think she is interesting in the way that she deals with other women. I think the sorceress is definitely very erotic, and like you also have that writhing naked dryad, which is just like there's a lot of chicks in this scene doing interesting stuff, and I think it's great. But I wouldn't necessarily say that I think that that's what's going on there, but I think there's room to read it that way, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to bring in more of that kind of element, because I think there's a place for it in the originals, and I think there's like a new way that we can deal with it in this cursed 21st century of ours.
And that's also too, like we were talking about the benefits of like not spelling everything out. It's like the sort of fragmented nature of these, like you can put that stuff in there and the story can like accommodate for it, as opposed to like, you know, completely changing the whole thing. It's like some stuff was already in there, and by the fragmentary nature, like you can add to it if you want, but it like it won't break the story, I guess. I think it is interesting, which is cool. Like
I just think that her writing is just so exciting, and like you can sort of find what you need in those stories in a way that is not necessarily present in all sword and sorcery writing, but I do think that she had a certain way of presenting the world that like you can see so clearly what she meant to say that like you're almost invited to see more than that, because you're not I mean, I love Lovecraft. I love his writing style. I actually like his precision of language, which people sometimes get like salty about, but like it's like no, like he used the word cyclopean for a reason here. Like that is the nature of this building. And so like if you know what his words mean and you stop to sort of like, I didn't know all the words. I still don't necessarily have a great concept of Rugos, right? But if you take the time with one of his stories and you look up all these words, then you do get a very clear picture of it with these archaisms. But like Moore isn't like that. She's just sort of like, she's just giving you this almost like crystalline like vision that I think then allows the mind to then spiral outwards. Whereas Lovecraft, I think you kind of have to go inward to really see what he was doing. And I just a different style, and I think it's really cool.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I totally agree with you. I think that that's kind of what I really got out of these stories was like you said, just the way that she just hints at this whole kind of world around this character that has so much going on that is, you know, sometimes even like subtextual, like, you know, we kind of talked a little bit about how ambiguous Jirel's backstory is, but there is something there, and it's presumably fascinating.
No, and
but you don't necessarily need it spelled out.
And I was thinking the thing that gets me from the Jirel stories that I find myself returning to in my mind that I actually chose not to. One of my first ideas when Oliver Brackenbury and I were first talking about like what would a Jirel story look like, back in September of last year, I think is when he contacted me. We were sort of having like a pitch meeting kind of thing, not like the YouTube series, just like an actual sort of thing. But like I was like, he was like, well, do you think you want to use anything from the original stories? And I'm like, well, actually, the one thing that I just really would love to explore is that woman in Black God's Kiss when Jirel's like running around and there's this like woman leaping like a frog through this. And like we never go back to this, like it's just, like she and Jirel's like, wow, that's weird. And I'm like, I love her. Who is this person? What is her? And eventually I abandoned that idea. I did not necessarily want to explicate on that because it's just so interesting on its own that I didn't want to I didn't want to do like solo Star Wars story to like the frog woman and let's leave it alone. And so like
George Lucas being like, we can see the woman, we know who she is now.
And there's some of my favorite sword and sorcery novels is Inyana, The Touch of Undying by Michael Shea, which like is not a famous book at all. In fact, I think it's out of print, which if I could bring one book back into print, I don't like it would be a strong case for this book because I just think it's super great. Plus because like you have like as your adventurer, your sword and sorcery adventuring hero is this like little weenus, like this chubby little academic who has never done anything exciting in his life. And I'm like, yes, this guy is me. Like, it's just like, and he gets like wrapped up in this quest for immortality essentially. And he goes through all these sort of picaresque scenarios, but like the opening to that book has him having a conversation with a waiter at a restaurant where he's like, well, tell me about the roast homunculus. And the waiter's like, oh, I'm sorry, sir. It's farm raised. It's not wild caught. Like we've had such a problem with vampires in the hills. We don't have any wild caught homunculus. And like Brampt, our hero, is like, oh, did the vampires feed on the homunculi? And he's like, no, they feed on the trappers. And then the book just like moves on from this. Like I have thought about this opening like so many times, and like I just think that it's so that and it's like in another book it would have been about that, but no, that's just our intro to the book. Like he orders something for dinner, and then this like lady of means comes in, and like the book just sort of takes off. And so and sort of thinking about that opening is what made me abandon using anything in the Jirel stories other than sort of some allusions to her prior adventures, which I do a bit, but I wanted to do something new because Jirel's not about looking back. Jirel's always looking forward. Like she's not thinking about what happened yesterday. She's busy dealing with whatever jerk wizard is on her case today.
I like to think that at the end of Black God's Shadow, after she's like gone literally to hell and back to like save this guy's soul, like Yeah, like a wizard like
Right,
walks
yeah.
by her and she gets so
Oh, for
pissed
sure.
off that she completely forgets about everything that she did
Probably.
before
I
that
would
and never
totally
thinks
believe
about it
that. She
again for
does
the
not
rest of
seem
her
to think a
life.
lot about what had happened.
No, there's
Yeah,
so
and
much
I
going
also
on
like
at the moment. There's so
Yeah.
many
was it in
wizards to piss her
Hellsguard that
off.
like her men got captured? I thought that like that was again a
Yeah.
nice detail. She's like, I'm going into this mansion
Well,
like to
no,
get my men back.
it's like
So yeah, like some she sees some wizard, her men get
another
fucked
jerk
over, and
with a
she's
G
like,
name
oh
has
yeah,
captured her soldiers, and he's like, I need you to go to Hellsguard and get a secret treasure. Then you can have them back if you bring it back to me. And she's like, ah,
oh
fuck.
yeah,
And then like
okay,
goes and like does indeed go to get this secret treasure from this castle in order to get her men back. But in terms of, we were speaking earlier about like her relationship with her retainers and stuff, like the fact that she would literally do that for them, I think is just such an interesting but not very explored character moment. Like the whole
yeah,
thing is about her doing it, but she's not thinking about why. We never
Yeah,
learn their
yeah.
names. We don't, they're almost unimportant, but she would go literally to Hell Castle to save their lives because that's just the kind of leader she is. And I think that's really fascinating.
yeah,
There's kind of this I don't think it's super well explored. There's kind of this idea of her as like, despite the fact that she's a woman and therefore this is kind of out of sorts, she's kind of like the ideal like feudal overlord. Like she's both very removed but like incredibly like loyal to those under her and will like go to hell and back to like literally to protect them in the very literal like second estate, those who fight sense.
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, yeah.
I'm there for it. Yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah, Hellsguard's so good, man. Everybody should go read that. Like,
Yeah,
if
you're
like,
gonna read one of these, go read Hellsguard because that story is.
That, and I've said this in a few podcasts that I've done talking about this new story, is that I just like want people to anthologize that story more so than Black God's Kiss, because I just think it has it all, and I think it's a fine introduction to her as a character, and maybe it does set you up for sort of being like, oh, the only way, okay, so like if like it does set you up at the top of things, but like a lot of times when you see things anthologized, like you may or may not go out and seek out the rest of it, so you can kind of find like the best expression of this, and I definitely think that.
Yeah, I wonder if just Black God's Kiss is a little bit more anthologized just because it has the sort of more high magic kind of visual elements.
It's a great
that
story. It rules.
It's absolutely.
Yeah.
I just wonder if that's maybe the reason why it gets picked a little bit more over Hellsguard, which, well, I think it's a better story, maybe like kind of in the aesthetics is just like a little bit more off. You know, it's not necessarily like I said, I agree, totally like great introduction to the character. But if you really like Hellsguard and you're like, I want more of exactly this, you're going to get something a little different. Which
more spooky vampire family, and it's like, sorry, not here. Like I can tell you many places to go, but not there. Actually, I was thinking, so last year I was asked to blurb this book of stories by a woman named Gray Laspina, who is another author who's contemporary of Lovecraft and Howard and C.L. Moore. And she was actually published in Weird Tales more times than Lovecraft.
Really?
But she has this like sexy vampire story about this like lady vampire who will get you. And like that is where I would go for like your gothic thing. Like all of her stories are like the high, like just so melodramatic and like so about all this different stuff. And I don't think she's quite as, what does this mean? I don't think she's quite as good of a writer as C.L. Moore. Like she definitely is like a true pulp badass, right? Like here's your story. I have it to you by 5 o'clock. Like, see, like she definitely has that like interesting vibe to her, but like, man, her stories are like they are just a ride from start to finish. Like she has this one about like a sexy mad scientist whose wife's always trying to get on his body, but he's only interested in capturing the human soul. And I'm like, I literally think about this story all the time.
Well, that's like exactly those memes you see. Like, you haven't talked to me in 4 hours or whatever. It's like, sorry, I'm trying to find the human soul.
I bet he's thinking about, what is he thinking about? I'm thinking about capturing the human soul. It's like, I know. It's just, they're so good. And I highly recommend them if you're into pulp, into the pulp aesthetic. They're not sword and sorcery, but they definitely have the same kind of feel as like, and I think, I can't remember the name of the publisher, but there was an anthology of Gray Laspina stories that came out last year. And I highly recommend them if you're interested in the sort of pulp vibe of like the 30s and 40s. They're really good.
Yeah, if we can track down the title here, we'll put it in the show notes for folks who might be interested. No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. We can figure it out later. I'm
my
sure
brain is definitely like an attic full of boxes and cobwebs. Over here. Like, yeah.
That's a huge part of why Ben and I started the show, is because we just realized, the just getting filled up with boxes. Yeah. We need some way to like collate this stuff.
For sure.
And I also feel like good podcasts are good for those like pocket pulls, because you're like, if you try to plan it out, it's like you're gonna think about it in the moment, and that's podcasting to me. So
yeah, that's good.
All right. Well, it looks like we've been going for like 90 minutes, Molly. I don't know how much time you have. Obviously, I feel like we could probably talk for like another hour, but I understand if you need to get going, or it feels like we're kind of circling around like a good point to draw things to a close.
Before I really start babbling, like
I said, we'll have to have you back on sometime soon, because I feel like you've obviously read a lot of stuff that's very cool. So we'd love to have you on to talk Lovecraft or something, or next time you have something coming out,
fantastic.
We'd be happy to have you on to chat about that. But so I guess before we kind of draw things to a close, I guess we should maybe talk a little bit more about the news story, just from the standpoint of when's it coming out? Where can people read it?
This is the plug section of the podcast.
Right,
yeah. So if you want to kind of tell people about a little bit about New Edge, and what they're doing, and how people can get their hands on Jirel and the Mirror of Truth, and that comes out, or any other writing you have coming soon, chance to tell the nice people.
Yeah. Okay. So, Jirel and the Mirror of Truth will appear in New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine's 3rd issue, which should be coming out late fall this year, I think, is what they're angling for. You can order it we can put the link in the show notes. I think that would probably be best.
Yeah, absolutely.
The crowdfund is already over, but you can definitely pre-order the magazine. It's going to be gorgeous. The cover artist it's actually got Jirel on the cover, and the cover artist is really captured Jirel and her her wild yellow eyes and her curly hair. Her name is let me see if I can pronounce this. It's Sasha. Where did I put this document here to try to get this right, and I cannot find it. But sorry. Her name is Sasha Duvodik, I think, and she is amazing. And then the interior art is by this artist named Saprofiel, and we found her, or Oliver found her. I had nothing to do with it. Oliver found her because she did this amazing art for the Jirel of Joiry role-playing game, the Black God's Kiss role-playing game that came out, or is coming out. I don't know. It was also crowdfunded. Her art is amazing. I got really all choked up when I saw it, because I've never really had there's 4 illustrations for my story because of how generous people were during the crowdfund. It's amazing. The art's really cool. She sent me an original, and now I have it, and I'm going to get it framed in my office. And so the magazine is going to be gorgeous. It's New Edge's vibe is Oliver's whole mission with it is to sort of, again, open up sword and sorcery to new kinds of voices, new kinds of writers, international writers, people who are sort of looking to expand the world that sword and sorcery can encompass. It's a really cool project. It's a gorgeous magazine. Oliver is very into things like the weights of the paper and stuff like that. And so it's just very old fashioned in this way that I think is really cool. I'm not sure if you can still order the hardback, but but that might be an option for people. I can't remember, because I can't remember any facts. But yeah, it should be out later this year. I'll provide the link. And then in terms of, and also all the back issues are really cool too. There's I think that the first issue of New Edge had a new Elric story by Michael Moorcock in it. And so if you are there for this kind of thing, New Edge is a great place to sort of subscribe and to find this sort of this new aesthetic, and also a sort of a backwards look at where we've come from. And so I think it's really cool. In terms of what I have coming out, I had a story come out earlier this year in the Sunday Morning Transport. It's very different. It's actually almost like a literary fiction story, sort of about a science fiction writer. And then next year, I have a story coming out in a really cool anthology called 120 Murders, that is all about fiction, dark fiction of the alternative era. And I think the brief that the writers got was you have to sort of have a story that like by a band or an artist that may have appeared like on MTV and sort of like the age of that sort of when MTV had music on it. And so mine is a crime fiction story called The Best in Basement Radio. It's a novelette about like some of my real experiences going to my college, Rollins College, in 2002 when I was a DJ for the college radio station there. The part of the story is not real is that I was not once accused of murder. And so that's good. But there is a real anecdote about a time that I talked one of my dorm mates into pepper spraying his own balls. And so like that is he had it coming. I dared him and he said, so it's not my fault. But anyway, like that anecdote is sort of the heart of that story because it is just a weird thing that happened to me this one time. So yeah, I have that coming out, and then it's not been announced, but I will have like a new novella coming out soon. But I can't really get into that yet because there hasn't been like an official announcement. But it'll be really fun when that happens. So
very cool. We'll be looking forward to that. That anthology sounds really cool.
It's really
very
cool.
Excited,
There's going to be a lot of really
good
writers in it. It's from House of Gamut Publishing, and it'll be out next year. And you can pre-order now. And there's going to be like I don't know who's been announced and who hasn't, but like the list of writers is like really exciting, especially if you like dark or crime fiction. It should be really, really great read.
That sounds awesome. Yeah. And co-signed on New Edge, like everything I've seen from them has been really, really cool. Hopefully going to be having someone from their team on the show here soon to chat. So I gotta send some emails, but Oliver and I have been in touch. So that's good. Yeah. Well, cool. Well, listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of more interview style one. Obviously, we always keep it to the conversation, but this definitely felt a little more freewheeling in a way that was very fun.
Definitely bring a chaotic vibe to the party. Like I don't know. Yeah.
No, it's great. It's absolutely great.
We're all here for it. Yeah. We don't want it to be like a book report. We're always like, I hope it doesn't become like a book report podcast. So
Ben and I are very much of the vibe that it's like podcasts are a medium about keeping it loose.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for having me. This was a gas. I really appreciate it. And talk about all this.
Thanks for coming.
I'd love to talk about Lovecraft or really, anything else. Like it's been a while since I read Don Quixote, but I just read Les Miserables. Like my day job is I edit manga. I edit Japanese comics for a living. And
cool.
Like a couple of years ago, maybe just last year, we did an 8-volume retelling of Les Miserables in manga form. And I admit that having seen the musical and listened to the soundtrack 1 bazillion times, I had never read it, and it finally made me read Les Miserables. And I was like, whoa, this is really cool. And so I'm always like down to also just read like a classic that I may have missed or visited for a long time.
No, I said your master's was in 18th century lit. Maybe it'd be fun just to do something a little more off the beaten path there. So we'll definitely talk.
Yeah, I'd be about that too.
Great.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, thanks so much.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being so generous with your time. This was so much fun.
Yeah, it really was.
Semper Books. Yeah.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.